So actually, speaking of Fusion Fest, I work with Michelle Puppets, and we are working on the big puppets that will be performed at Fusion Fest. So if you want to volunteer to learn how to move a big puppet, you can also learn how to do that and look up Michelle Puppets, Michelee. All right, so that's not what I was going to say. So when I was thinking about Spooked, I was thinking about fears. And when you're little, you have fears that grow less as you get older. So, afraid of the dark, afraid of monsters under your bed, things like that, afraid of getting lost at a shopping mall. But as I got older, I had a fear that kept growing. And that was a fear of a phone call. I was afraid that I would get the phone call that my grandmother had passed away. And I was very fearful of this happening. So as I would sit there and I would hear the phone buzz or something, I would be like, oh, is this the time? And so in March of 2012, I got a phone call that my grandmother had fallen. And I rushed up to Pennsylvania immediately to come and see her. She was 92, and she and my grandfather lived in a retirement community. And they had met because he was a POW, and he had come back from war, and he said, she was in the kitchen. And she never left. So she was at his welcome home party because her cousin was dating his brother. And that's how they met, and they were married ever since. So they're living in this retirement community. My grandfather is in congestive heart failure. He's in the hospital, and my grandmother's alone, and she's fallen. And when I get there, she's about 70 pounds and just very dehydrated. And she could speak, but not the way that she would normally speak. She had this beautiful Bronx accent, and she used to call me Jamie Dia. And she worked in some of the toughest schools in the Bronx. She spoke multiple languages, and now here she is, limited to just very few words. And the reason that the relationship with my grandmother was so important is until I was an adult, I didn't realize I grew up in a very unhealthy household, which is a story for another time. But when I went to go visit my grandmother, and my sister and I would go, it would be the most amazing experience. She would take us to the library. She was a librarian. And she would bring home books, and she would read us stories about Gretchen and the Carousel and take us to these imaginary worlds. And she would always do the voices and make things really interesting and fun for us. And she always made us feel important. So one of the things that she used to do is she used to sing everything. She would turn everything into a song. I'm washing the dishes, and, things like that. And we would laugh and make fun of her, and of course, now that we're adults, we do the exact same thing. So when I went up to see her, I thought, let's bring some music in. So I brought the Sirius satellite radio 40 station in, and we were playing music. And, she was mostly sleeping, and she sat up one time, and she kind of looked at me, and then she started petting my head and going, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And I was like, Grandma, you're sick. You don't need to apologize for that. And then she kind of gestured over to the radio, and the song was called I Apologize. So she was like 70 pounds, could barely speak, but she's squeaking out these words. So at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Monday, I got a phone call, and my grandfather had passed away. And we went to the retirement place where they both lived, and we had to break the news to my grandmother, who was also very sick. And she cried, but she didn't have tears. So she just shook and shook and shook. And it was at that moment that my fear changed. I had been so afraid of her dying. And at that moment, I was afraid of her living like this, because all of her faculties were there in her brain, but her body had just given out. So my grandparents had a plot in New Jersey, and so we went to New Jersey to bury my grandfather. We told my grandmother, we'll be right back. So it was on a Wednesday that we buried him, and he had died on Monday. And we came back, and on Thursday, it seemed like she had stabilized, and I had been there for 2 weeks, and I had to go home. And my sister and I were getting ready to leave, so we stopped off to say goodbye to my grandmother. And we walked into the room, and I went and I held her hand, and she turned to me, and her jaw opened the way that a skeleton's jaw might open, just like this. And she whispered, bye. And she died. And there we were holding her hand as she died. And I had also had a fear of death and other people dying. And she gave me this wonderful gift as her final moments where she said goodbye and let us be there for that moment. She waited for us to bury her husband, and then when we got back, she left us. So that's my story.